Hello everyone, today we talk about the demographic and economic contraction of early medieval Europe and more specifically the Latin Germanic one, in important function of reconstructing the environment, the physical environment in which the laboratories lived. We made, I think, years ago a video about the tripartition of the social order in medieval times, in which we were explaining essentially how this order was set and whether there is an enormous ideological rather than just historiographical debate in this, because it basically digs a little bit back into the question of idealism and materialism, as the tripartite social order reflects the older Indo-European idea of the priests, the warriors, and effectively the slaves rather than anything else. Of course, there were other freemen, but these were meant, and they worked, but they were meant in theory just to be noblemen with serfs that they had, serfs slash slaves that would work for them. So naturally, that's in fact a bit of an idealistic view of the thing. Reality was a bit more meager, right? And we can, that if I made a video about that topic today, I would probably say more interesting things than I said before, because I think the time it's not that we were from the material side of the story, but we also observed confirming, in fact, the existence of the tripartite social order. However, how this could overlap and how every human fundamentally can be kind of even the three things at once, if we talk at least in strictly material terms, while definitely at the time the existence of an ideal order, or the idea of sacred, that is a category, conceptual category that the world doesn't understand anymore, anywhere, and actually in the elite, in the value, in fact in the hierarchical sense, that was really dominating at the time, through the same hierarchies, in fact, is practically meaningless as as an average language meaning significance to people today. We have been so much fed by a materialistic approach, a progressistic, modernistic, technologistic, secularistic approach, that we don't understand anything, right? It doesn't matter being right or left or wherever you come from. It has no meaning. Basically, nobody has the understanding of what that order was meant to be. But definitely focusing on the laboratories as such is crucial, also from that socio-economical point of view that we tend not to maybe appreciate when we criticize, in fact, the structuralist approach. That is, however, really how people lived, right? And as you know, if you have followed my videos about medieval society, I don't have a romantic idea of the Middle Ages. I think, first of all, that this era didn't exist as such. There is nothing that you can fundamentally put like a medieval standard and saying this thing existed just in the medieval times, Middle Ages. These were systems that are dramatically more useful to study in a millenary perspective, in a plurimillenary perspective, in fact beyond the medieval one, that were in fact largely unaltered, and in fact they help more to understand what the world was like at the time more concretely. And the physical environment in which the laboratories lived in early medieval times was really rough, right? Some people say, well, no, because during the Iron Age or the early Middle Ages, when this great latifundias of the Roman and the feudal times respectively didn't exist, this kind of sinusoidal trend of civilization occurred, people lived better. Why? Because they were individually freer. Well, good luck with that, right? Good luck with being an average early medieval freeman in Western Europe, especially in the areas that went more depopulated and where the Roman infrastructures declined, collapsed, and it was practically no state, etc., to just carve your heaven into the brutal wilderness and trying to to live off the land, and with a significant surplus that can afford you even just a perspective of living that is basically something above survival rate. Well, this is a bit the idea we've gotten, and the greater debate that fits there is, was it still better living like that, even though it was undoubtedly nightmarish, or was it better to be a feudal serf in, say, the late Middle Ages? That the debate gets more interesting because you understand that in the later Middle Ages, people lost freedom. That's another thing that you normally don't hear. They lost freedom in relative terms, meaning that literally the peasantry lost, as we've seen, the what maybe just in this case could be understood as a class struggle. That, however, there was no class, and that's the reason why they lost, by the way, in the first place, because they didn't have any awareness of the situation and broader horizons and interconnections, etc. Even though the Jacquerie and other movements were kind of a big thing. It was a real revolution back in the day, and they lost. Like up until the 18th century, like the whole system was unhinged, right? And the Ancien Regime really triumphed. And yet Europe kind of improved in those times. It was a richer, more advanced place than before. So the question is, yeah, you could be like a serf under somebody, etc. But how easier was it to leave? Say just in the 15th century rather than in the 7th. Even though, let's say, it's picking the extremes of at least juridically speaking, of personal freedom. That's a tough one, right? Because overall there was an improvement, right? And the reason why I think it was dramatically more difficult before, right? And I say dramatically not because we have to think at a scale difference, but we have to be concrete about the fact that even a tiny change in those precarious conditions, it makes it much worse in absolute terms. And I do think indeed that we have built the myth of the Dark Middle Ages exactly in function of this complete myth that is devoid of any historical foundation and evidence that, for some reason we bought after the Enlightenment. That is to say that, in fact, the modern age was kind of a better time for the individuals, that people were freer, that it was a greater centrality of people and their action. That's absolutely not true. That was a massively hierarchized and stratified and crystallized society, unlike anything had occurred in the Middle Ages. But yet, that could be a positive thing. And this is, in fact, what you don't hear in the debate, because actually the extreme left and the extreme right actually converge in the same thing. And that's the same reason why you don't see that you do believe that right and left are two opposite things that go in two opposite directions, actually going the same direction. That is, at the end of the day, communism, right? Nationalism is just a fourth chamber to communism. It's just fourth estate delusion. That is to say, fourth estaters being exactly the ones who were too weak to provide from themselves and having that intelligence and capacity of command or anything like the mass of people are today. That left space to the masters, like the ones that in feudal Europe made the great Western civilization as we know, building it literally through that certification, and with the only difference that at the time people were at least effectively under, and nobody really complained, right? We don't know what a peasant thought at the time. Of course, they weren't happy. History tells us that the peasantry, the people in general, the most disgustingly stupid, violent, and incapable part of society, and at the time they were kept under. Right, because history teaches us that if you give them a gun, they will escape that situation. Today, it's the triumph of the fourth estate. That is, the average moron that populates the world thinks that he's free and therefore provided with some kind of dignity, of importance, of capacity. But actually, it's just fitting a much broader game that should be bringing him under. Right, there should be really an order that brings you down and keeps you down. Exactly, because you're incapable of even realizing that condition, and that what's the entire true tradition, right? When these people talk about the true times where people were loaded in values, etc., they would have been just because of how they are today. I mean, peasants in the Middle Ages were dramatically more powerful, stronger, and capable people than the average person today. So even the inferior classes at the time were superior to the average moron today. And so that's what they don't understand, that even somebody that was considered a slave, a serf, would have been superior to them in a world that they idealized, thinking that their true values and ideas would have had a great, because they have no idea literally of the fact that the entire traditional order was based on the elite, on quality, on aristocracy meant in your own personal capacity, right? And complaining on the internet about, I don't know, the left that is so dangerous and problematic, and it immediately poses you in the position of being an inferior person, because if you even fear the left, if you even let it happen, it's your fault. It means you're worthless. You're even inferior to the left. It's something utterly disgusting, and that's basically what you kind of deserve, right? Together with the left as well, because that there, as I was saying before, that's essentially the same thing. It's the flattening of the individual. It's straight to communism. That is in fact the ideology that stood at the root of all Pelagianism, Chthonic, Aphrodisian, Dionysian, Telluric, Demetrian masses that were brought under the heavenly rulers, the nobility, the ones that had received the celestial glory to dominate the world, right? And that's what you should be aiming at, not just being an average moron. That's the point. You can really learn from history without, essentially denying everything you normally, people, even, this is the problem, they didn't even tell you it existed, right? That's the real deal here. So what happened at the time was much more brutal and horrifying than you can imagine. There are ways, however, to approach this landscape, because there is no doubt that in the West, especially in Germany, the forests were by far more extended and thicker, and the urban centers much more scarce and miserable than in the High Middle Ages, in later times. One should properly ask what changes the Germanic migrations had determined in the passage of the regions already dominated by Rome in the in this following times. And Rome is such a central topic that even in there, the measure by which it escapes this historiographical idea of this way we have settled by saying, there's kind of a classical antiquity, there were like the Greeks, the Romans, then there is the Middle Ages. Like it's again an incredibly secularistic, anti-traditional, and completely meaningless idea of reality. Like Rome was in the history of the world, and without any doubt, and from within a Western standpoint, the achievement of the greatest universal rule, that is what all the people in the world had aimed at, and that was never accomplished by the same qualitative and quantitative degree combined, like in Rome. And this was concretized by a massive, but I mean a massive infrastructure. And this massive infrastructure wasn't meant really, again, in the progressistic, technologistic sense of today, like, oh, look, the Romans, they had technology. Well, the Romans actually were using technology that other peoples already had, and simply because they were, a civilization expanding, they used it. And that's not even a shame, by the way. People say, oh, the Romans stole something, rather stealing technology. I mean, you're worse than those people that talk about cultural appropriation. Those leftists just say you can't have a hairstyle or a costume because it's a cultural appropriation. Oh my God! All civilizations are superior in virtue of their cultural appropriation. I mean, if you are able to dominate the world through something that others had, but they didn't manage to dominate the world through, you are superior to them. That's what civilization materially concretizes itself in. Rome dominated a space that, if you think about it, it's freaking mind-blowing. I mean, from Scotland to the Persian Gulf, creating I don't know how many thousands and thousands of kilometers of roads, a massive urban infrastructure. Structures, in fact, remained for a millennium as the base of the most advanced parts of the continent, or actually of Europe, the Mediterranean, also the areas of North Africa and the Near East, that kept living like this vestiges of giants into a Middle Ages that made it in different ways to channel its own enormous resources that were actually larger in absolute terms than the one of Rome in masterpieces. I mean, think about the 80 cathedrals were built in Europe during the High Middle Ages. These things went up and down, right? You know that the mid 14th century crisis stopped that. In Europe we finished building them in the 19th century actually. But this shows you how even considering properly the poverty that always existed historically everywhere, right? The Romans weren't swimming in wealth, in gold. Like, it was a brutal world. It was incredibly poor and miserable for any standard we can think of. Like, that's why we think, if you think about the Middle Ages, it's the same thing, right? There is not much of a difference in practice, right? And to start making comparisons here and there is mostly being hallucinated by, for example, the myth that we've made of Rome being, yes, it was true. It was a city-based empire because that was needed, even just administratively, in terms of logistically, for communications and so on. But as always, in any pre-industrial society, the overwhelming majority of the people lived in the countryside. And the countryside in Roman times, yes, was kind of different from the one of medieval times at some point, depending on which and how. But we're still talking basically about the same type of lifestyle for most of the periods, right? There is not much of a that's what I was saying before. When we study the medieval peasantry, we have to think that these people, even just in mindset, which is the single most important and the single most overlooked thing, and also the most difficult thing to document, but if one studies history, in fact, besides materialism, is able to form, to give a shape to, through the same millenary cycles that they had always had since the Bronze Age, right? Even before. And this is notorious, even just to anybody who studies folklore and the peasant lifestyle and so on. And so the elites, the hierarchies, are something else. They are those who are governed from the top on these masses of people, and that above are the ones that shape culture, who provide with that order, with that clarity, with that reason, with that structure. And adversing empires is not really a good idea, right? Because the empires exist if they succeed, right? So this is exactly what they believe back in the day. I mean, if you lost, it's because you didn't deserve whatever you were going for, so that you were not meant to, because it all depended on God, right? Because a single God existed even in pre-monotheistic times. That's the other story that you have been fed, unfortunately. Otherwise, but the universal meaning of the sacred was at the center of all these people's reality, and the hierarchy reflected that. So that a peasant probably didn't like to live the way he did, but he still recognized that the world was kind of like that, and there couldn't be realistically much that could be changed, even if they had been given the possibility of, because what do you actually do after something collapses? That's why having a respect and deference and admiration for something like the Roman Empire is crucial for any person worth the name of a Westerner in the first place, instead of making this disgusting nationalistic and hence anti-traditional factionalism based on, in fact, on identities that emerged simply later and as a form of involution of civilization. So going in reverse compared to what you should aim at as the hero of these religions, that is to say, taking over the world, right? To order it from the virtue of the reason and the strength and the power that you have deserved by by God, and appreciating the fact that yes, this thing collapsing in late antiquity was a major blow to the possibilities of recovery for quite a while, right? Because you see, the Dark Ages never quite existed in the way we intend. And if anything, it's just because they are not documented. Another cliche that we have is that the Middle Ages are somewhat more obscure, even just documentarily speaking, than the Antiquity. It's absolutely false for any person who has even, I think, an elementary historical education. We have an overwhelming greater amount of sources for the Middle Ages than for the entire Antiquity, right? So it's nonsense, and this shows also how the world ages and people grow, and so even when civilizations kind of go down, you still have something that acknowledges the existence of a universal trend and doesn't make relativism on the base of I like the Middle Ages, I don't like Antiquity, because we really got, or vice versa, because we really got to this point. Just go on social networks, just go on wherever you can spot things statistically en masse, and look at how people basically, they made a meme out of it. Most people that get interested in the Middle Ages or Antiquity make a meme out of it, meaning that look at me, I'm about medieval stuff, I'm the kind of aestheticistic, postmodernistic subculture that without any meaning or value or dignity, and look at me, I'm special. That's again the fourth S-staters that we have unlocked with the revolutions of the 18th century and the 19th century. We could have handled that very much better, right? There are instances of revolutions made by the top, like the Meiji one, for example. It's an exception. So that is to say, you shouldn't be hating modernity either. That's another meme. That's stupid. What you should be doing is realizing what we could have done with modernity and we couldn't do with modernity because we are ever weaker, right? And looking at the past and what it, confronted, ourselves and our ancestors at the time when things stagnated, and then there's just a growth, right? But it's indeed true that was a major collapse of the system. We see it at different stages, of course. There is a debate even on this, but too much debate means that people kind of lost the plot, because I think in many ways it's so evident from political and social indicators that you don't really need to make those things. Oh, look, I studied the Poland in this area of the Mediterranean in the beginning of the 6th century, blah, 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 and as if that had any value, historically speaking, just in the face of the overwhelming insight that the sources give us in other ways, right? And that's why materialism is overrated. Doesn't mean anything. We have lost in any field, in any scientific field, the capacity of having a comprehensive reading. That is to say, everybody becomes the prima donna because has discovered, oh, look at this innovative method. That is to say, a method that basically destroys any kind of synthesis capacity. That is the only thing your brain is being created for. And throwing it to the ground, transforming yourself into just a machine, and giving up any capacity, in fact, to even put up any civilizational, universal and sacred effort on the humanity that you claim to be defending in some ways. So this degradation is evident already in the last imperial Roman age, in relation not just with the lesser security that was the effect in turn of the recurring barbarian invasions, but also with the parallel crisis of the small, of the medium property ownership, let's say, of the peasants, right? That was all one with the enormous expansion of the fiscal and private latifundia, and that were not particularly easy to manage as well. This is yet another leitmotifs, as you know, of Roman historiography. I mean, the idea that the Roman Empire emerged fundamentally from this Romano-Italic confederacy that was a deeply militarized and warlike essentially farming class, right? They were barely civilized peasant soldiers that managed to take over with an enormous moral superiority the entire world, and that managed, in this sense, to become rich individually. But the aristocracy was never fundamentally checked enough, and so that prosperity in the early imperial times was provided by a balance between the enormously wealthy aristocracy that had mostly made the lion's share in the occupation of the conquered lands, etc., and the middle class, the equestrians, etc., collapsed in with the 3rd century crisis, 4th century, leaving space to essentially a sclerotic system that was overly that had properly, in fact, had not gentrified, but properly enslaved in practice the peasantry, that backbone that had kept together the strength of the Roman world, and that was just dominated by an elite that was ever more, yes, powerful, but also completely uninterested in recovering that that individual strength that had characterized it before. If anything, simply because of secularization and modernization, because that's what it brings, what wealth, excessive wealth brought to, in terms of also motivation, practice, and that also formed this heavily bureaucratic system that had to sclerotize the entire society at some point, to think about the Theodosian Codex, etc., and fundamentally the assimilation of cults and ideas that were ever more distant from the ancient Roman, that is effectively the ancient Indo-European religion of the origins, and kind of lost completely that. It kind of fell in love with itself. It was kind of a narcissistic self exaltation that denied even the existence of whatever existed outside. And here there is the shift, in fact, from the Roman to the Byzantine world, so that also much of that Latin element mingled better with the Germanic one in the West, whereas the Byzantine Greek one kind of still resumed that mentality that had been of the Hellenes, of the decadence, at least, of what we call the full democracy of Greece that we exalt, but that was actually a drift from the hardcore Indo-European ideals of the origins that were quite strong, by the way, in Greece too originally, and that is considered whatever exists outside of that culture as basically inferior, and so we are just the best. Point. End of a story. We are the Romans. Nobody can copy us, but we don't really have to do anything factually to prove it at a greater level, and the world in the process kind of collapsed entirely because, as you know, the empire was never reunited. The Latin Germans brought on the fore of the world the Western civilization in ways that are definitely remarkable and extremely impacting, but still kind of losing the plot for the aforementioned secularistic, modernistic trends that we have seen. And so basically no other culture was so well balanced like the West historically up to this day to claim any kind of superiority, even remotely so, right? So that even criticism of the West from the West is actually that the prevalence of that fourth estater delusion, hallucination, and self-hatred because of inferiority complexes that have nothing to do with anything that is traditional European or Western at the core, and just will make them degenerate into the darkness of the surrounding world that doesn't show any glimpse of civilization, frankly enough, and that's it. And as the saying the Europeans thought, yes, the world ages and things will go pretty bad over time. The same Christianity thinks actually the same thing. Satan has to rule on the earth before the second advent of Christ, and so this is actually, I think, a spot-on idea, because at the end of the day, our degree of weakness is unspeakable, and so the bigger picture in this regard is crucial, even for understanding things like what about the work in general in early medieval times. So late Roman times were rough. Right, the barbarian invasions were really disruptive because these peoples didn't quite have any other horizon but loot. The other thing would have been seizing land, but the empire for centuries was too strong to provide them with any of that. The migrating peoples were also kind of desperate, right? You don't really migrate with an enormous risk in of being wiped out in the process, as it would happen to many of them by other peoples that were migrating at the same time by the same Romans, etc. And putting everything at stake for something that is not a dramatic situation of insecurity, of shortage, of instability, of misery, of poverty. And we see it just materially speaking, or from the art, from the mindset we can read among these people. It's a very obscure thing. We made a video about the Germanic Norse religion. We have seen how among all the Indo-European ones, it's basically the darkest, because it does reflect that different standards of living condition. But it was kind of still aware of the fact of the risk. It was militarized enough. It was much closer to the connection between the political action and between politics and violence than the majority of these other people. So that they were, especially the chieftains, but also the war bands, were kind of very tough, right? They had a very limited horizon whenever it came to technology, administration, material capacities, but they had perhaps a much clearer view in relative terms of what it took to command and to invade and to seize to achieve effectively what would happen in Latin Germanic Europe with Romano-Germanic kingdoms. And so the decline goes in parallel. I mean, there is hardly any, because some say, in the 4th century, Constantine had, Diocletian, Constantine, before the Illyrian emperors had essentially restored the empire. So this is a moment of great stability and of prosperity. You can't really say the empire declined, right? There is this narrative that roams around. As you know, I'm a great fan of the Constantinian era, the Constantinian army. There were lots of interesting things in that system, but objectively, it was a much more cumbersome empire to manage in many ways, and in fact, it wouldn't have much of a long life in that regard. Basically, just some generations in its integrity, then things started going bad again. I mean, Augustus at least created a system that lasted for 300 years. This thing lasted less, so and one can't really deny that things had gone worse for most people in the empire in the process. Again, these are not things that you can really stop or prevent. You could always prevent that, and the idea, in fact, should be to always keep up those standards of individual strength and capacity, etc. But in the, when you have such enormous systems, and people are just many, and they don't understand that they unavoidably go under. Again, it's not such a bad thing. It's the natural reaction to eventually a society that also has to defend itself in some fashion. The new order, also the alliance between the empire and the church, the change of trend. I mean, the mob, the masses didn't believe anymore in the archaic Roman religion. At that point, what was different between a henotheistic, Hellenistic cult and Christianity? I mean, Christianity was actually even better, right? Especially in the way it overloaded itself culturally once it was rendered legal, because it basically absorbed an enormous deal of what the classical tradition was and worked enormously to make things work. And in the West, it made things work in many ways. Many people are critical of this, who say, no, it's not true. Christianity had betrayed the older values. I don't believe so. It's an asymptotic question. I will discuss this in other ways, of course. There is a brutal change in many ways, and there is even a reversal of certain concepts. But these concepts can be still extended to an infinite, to a zero value that you have to, again, to interpret and see whether they are actually not part of the same problem that, as we were saying before, right? A great part of Christianity and the ancient pagan tradition overlap. Not because Christianity copied it, but because Christianity emerged from the same pagan background and believed exactly the same things in practice. Then it was provided with other features and other perspectives, but we don't have to fool ourselves with the fact that, again, that universalistic perspective was shared by all religions from everywhere. It was not just Indo-Europeans, it was about also the Semites and so on. It's really universal. You can find it even in the Americas at the same time. You would say, how is it possible? because it's kind of obvious in many ways what you have to believe, and people still have so many problems to do and accept they have to believe in anything today, which is not really a good insight, which for anybody in the past would have been crystalline clear, because there are not really alternatives, existentially speaking, what you must believe as a human being. And again, that tells you how low we have fallen. So the Roman Empire did decline. It's useless to try to whitewash these times by saying, well, after all, it's all relative, you can't really tell. This shouldn't be weaponized either as some sort of, of factionalism either, right? We should take these, again, as universal trends. We should see Rome and the other peoples, exactly because Rome was a universal empire, as being on the same boat. And this is particularly evident with the Germans, right? As we were saying before, the Germans were while invading the Roman Empire, and even after that, weren't faring well at all, right? They were just essentially a few tens of thousands armed men, plus the civilian population, even though the difference there between military and civilian didn't really exist. But let's say, in a single battle, it could be wiped out. This is effectively what happened to some of them. Others risked that still up to the last decade of existence of the Western Roman Empire. They lived in precarious situations, were settled by the Romans in largely depopulated areas, most of the times at least, and initially. They had to fight against other peoples oppressed continuously. I mean, they didn't have much of an internal cohesion most of the times. At least they found difficulties on that ground that brought, eventually in early medieval times, as you see, generally speaking, to a fragmentation. Right? There were very few, if any, Romano-Germanic kingdoms that had a real things like, public authority, a stability of pacification, right? There could be heydays of great expansionistic phases, like bringing under the surrounding peoples or having, but eventually this thing fragmented because there wasn't really much of another thing aside from the private mindset in that thing. If you have followed the migration era playlist, you know what we're talking about, given that I think we made hundreds of videos at this point on these specific topics of political social balance of the Romano-Germanic world, and we will always keep talking about that. And generally speaking, the demographic or economic impact on this world was enormous, right? We said, there was, in the 6th century, there's been the great pandemic of Justinian that struck basically all over Eurasia. Probably wasn't really just a consequence of the Ostrogothic War, but it's like the Black Death later on. We don't really know whether these pandemics were a cause as opposed to a consequence of war and of a general decline and stagnation that had already happened. People getting worse fed and being more unstable, living in worse conditions, and therefore being more exposed to pathogen agents. And naturally, this doesn't mean that it couldn't be the same thing. But I mean, unsurprisingly enough, in a sense, because it's coincidental, this major pandemics never happen in a moment of great prosperity where everything goes well. There's always a moment of stagnation, we're not a recession, and they have to do, in part, with that, aside from the randomness, naturally, from which they can emerge, which is definitely a thing. In any case, I personally, as a military historian, I studied a lot, in particular the connection between, among other things, I specialize in tactics, but I did study also the striking coincidence of all the main political and social upheavals in coincidence with military events, right? I documented some part of my work, an enormous overlapping, which is at the end of the day what the Clausewitz Trinity is about, of the, for example, loss of freedom, politically speaking, in coincidence of military defeat, which is kind of obvious, right? You would think, well, we kind of understand that, but you don't really find it historiographically speaking, because again, the the materialistic side of the story that naturally clashes with the unpredictability and the moral forces of politics and of war, tells you no, that history is just very complex changes that you can't really understand. It's an illusion. You have to look at the no, right? Major decays and collapses happen in coincidence with very specific political military actions that disintegrate certain realities, and it's silly not to see it. And this thing has an enormous impact. The sheer cost, especially on pre-industrial societies that had an incredibly fragile agriculture and connected agrarian cycles, and things like the possibility of triggering famines and consequently also demographic growth, and in fact illnesses and natality rate and all this stuff are all one, right? So if you have a war that ravages an entire province, we've seen it in many, the border, the frontier provinces of the empire were largely or kind of depopulated. The places where things decayed more quickly. Also, it is true because they were before poorer places. They were colder, which is not good for agriculture. That's you can't have much surplus there. They consequently they're also kind of more unstable by themselves because people will have to raid and pillage and therefore be more militarized to live around. And so there is this dramatic competition that brings to further destruction and instability. They hadn't had civilization before, right? Civilization does operate osmotically, so they would decay earlier. Areas like Britain or the Germanic provinces of the empire, the Danubian frontier, that would become a frontier even during the migration era for much longer than the migration era ended in Western Europe, by the way. And so these were incidentally the areas where most of the federati settled, and so they didn't have much of an easy life, as we were saying before. So it was a great compromise in a way among masses of people that still talk to each other and that integrate and cooperated, as we've seen very often, and that managed to find new solutions, but in an incredibly precarious world that you can't quite picture in its misery if you have not even lived properly in a third world country, accurately. But even more, because frankly, it's more the fourth world than the third world that we're talking about. I mean, depending on maybe something in between. Let's put it in this way. Because modernity, again, really changed a lot. It's not a matter of technology, of material stuff. It's about mindset. It's about properly what you're normally up to in order to cope with this. So, as we were saying at the beginning, there is the infrastructural thing, right? The Roman organization of public works, and particularly the care for the efficiency of the communication routes. These things collapsed. They left space to the roughness and the carelessness of the Germanic dominations that objectively couldn't really do much about that decline anymore, and that's why they let it rot away. The degradation of the territory becoming ever more general and profound. There is some criticism about this. Again, the technologistic bias that you've been fed is, the Romans just had everything they had because they had technology. As if technology is, magic that can out-trick the brave and pure tribes that were conquered by Romans, were so terrible people, and that were, by the way, they had nothing in common with tribes and, the same exact, hardcore beliefs. No, they were just something different, just remove from your mind. This is yet another consequence of the fourth estators being allowed to vote in the last centuries. This system was kept together, in fact, because of the enormous resources that these moral forces had been able to control and to organize and put together, with making infrastructures that if you think are crazy, even just for the cost of the time, and that yet had kept this empire, had helped keeping this empire together. Proof that technology is not enough is that the empire crumbled anyway. So that came at the dissolution of moral forces, and that were to again be reused in other ways. As you know, great part even of civilian infrastructures in of the Roman era in medieval times were used literally as military stuff. I don't know, the Colosseum was like a castle, or you could have that in many other ways with aqueducts and so on. The roads were upkept, needed that, and they kind of died out. But it was obvious because, like, would it have the resources of that empire? It's kind of obvious. Every time there's a massive public thing that collapses, everything that made the major things running collapses as well, right? For all the libertarians out there, that's the perennial pattern that the entire history evidences in a macroscopic fashion, right? You cannot really have a civilization without a degree of centralization, and the fact it collapses is not because of the form; it's because of the substance. It's because of how much you fill it with force to go on, right? And regressing to something more individualistic is not an improvement in the development of civilization. It simply meant that you gave up because you were too weak when you had all the opportunity to take it to the next step. And this is, generally speaking, also the great problem why any civilization ever existed. But this meant really a lot. I mean, think about aqueducts. Those brought waters to major urban centers that unavoidably, without those, decline. Think about the same Rome. In fact, the major collapse happened after the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths of Vitiges destroyed the main aqueducts during the Gothic War for besieging the Byzantine forces in Rome at that point. Not that they would have done it anyway. They were the ones ruling Italy at that point quite effectively, considering the other Germanic standards. So populations that crumble suddenly because literally there's nowhere to drink. You see it even in archaeology, that people shift from areas that were served by plumbing, etc., to the rivers. Within the same city gates, you have all this population settlement shift. That's quite evident. People simply and naturally went back living in the countryside, being more isolated because the cities were targets of the raids. And the countryside was first like a massive latifundium, so a very well organized sort of concentration camp for slaves to produce this massive agricultural resource. It was a bit stagnating because the agricultural resources were of course, were specialized cultivations and so on. But I mean, the senators had mostly, they had extensive cultivations because they were cheaper, right? So just because they were so wealthy that they didn't give a damn to make better, right? And so that had what had in part also softened up the mores, because instead the middle sized farm owner, let's say, had kind of more interest to invest in more qualitative improvements in his farm. And so that the struggle we were saying before, well, this latifundia, once that the main, a Roman army was defeated by some barbarians. The barbarians came to raid the area. Latifundia were open. It was massive, extensive territory, ground surfaces that were ravaged because they were also the major, like, it was like bingo from the other side. You could pillage these entire extensions of crops. It was the first target. So as a consequence, these things were open, roughly. In medieval times, this thing shrinks around, around the villa that would be increasingly fortified and becoming kind of more like a moat and bailey castle later on, with the peasants concentrated mostly in the center, and therefore the atomization of these various courts and centers that would fragment further the political reality, because before, just one family that was in the Senate controlled massive latifundia across multiple provinces. In early medieval times, the largest estates were something like, I don't know, we can appreciate maybe in tens of kilometers on average, at least if they were quite big ones, only in places like Gaul or Spain, by the way. And you can understand what this reflects. How do you control those areas, even? And as a consequence, also the absolute impoverishment brought to differentiation in type of cultivations, and also to a more closed economy. Indeed, the international exchange was more difficult. There were pirates, there were brigands. Public authority couldn't really do much about that. Actually, public authority very often behaved in the same way because there was also no other way to centralize otherwise. And so here you have the effect, which is not really a good one. In all this, also think about dams. There are still lakes in Europe today that the Romans had managed to dry out for cultivations with dams, with other infrastructures. These things collapsed, and there are lakes again, and that's it. And so forests, swamps, those had always existed also in the most prosperous moments of the Roman Empire, right? They had always preserved very remarkable extensions, because again, think about even just how this looks from, I don't know, from the satellite, if they had something like that. Like, Roman cities were not particularly big. I mean, yeah, they were big for the times. More than else, they were also many, right? So that does give you a measure of how many people also lived in the cities and how much surplus there was to afford that. But still, they were kind of small, right? Very often they are extensionally like the historical center of the city where you come from. And they were many cities, but also not so capillary distributed. So the entirety of the rest was countryside. And also, yeah, there were many people living in Europe at the time, but not so many compared to us. It would be something ridiculous. And so large areas were just, by lack of labor force in the first place, left just like wilderness. And some areas probably were not worth of the pain, right? That's why the Romans at the end of the day decided to kind of bail out of Germany, because they realized we can't even defeat this guy. We have the military potential. It's just what do we do to keep them eventually? These places are really rough, right? You have to work for generations before building infrastructures that hold themselves up together. I mean, how long is that gonna cost, right? If I have an enormous universal military power, I can simply use deterrence to control these peoples. That's how it had been, because as you know, the limit or the borders of the Roman, the boundaries of the Roman Empire were the ones of the wine, the grape, and the wheat, essentially. And that's also very powerfully environmental, climatological dimension, because it makes you understand that without those specific cultivations, you couldn't really sustain the surplus for even maintaining an army there. There are some substances that were used from grape, for example, that were used to preserve food. If you didn't have that, the army couldn't have supplies. And that's the reason, I don't know, even in today's world, think about Germany, the Agri Decumates into today's southwestern Germany. Those were the only areas that the Romans occupied, because they are the only ones that have a warm enough climate to have grape cultivated there. That is still cultivated there because the Romans brought it. The rest was really much more problematic, right? Also talking about, Germany of the time, because the southern one, as you know, was Celtic at the time, and the one the Romans occupied. And so the divides there are really important. And consider that, of course, also the customs of the peoples that arrived were problematic, right? This is something that already the Celts had found out the hard way. They were kind of rich and prosper. They had managed to reach kind of a proto-urban reality. They had an important trade network, communication routes, and so on, technological capacities. Then the Germans arrived, and archaeology tells us that Germans were freaking brutal. I mean, basically destroyed everything. And, in those Celtic areas. So that was quite dramatic. In many ways, this happened, of course, less in Roman times, because the Germans had been Romanized. They had been living essentially half of a millennium close to Rome. They knew what it was about, right? They had assimilated a lot. They understood that they didn't have to destroy, right? In Augustan times, those were literally prehistorical peoples, right? And they're quite interesting as such, because one of the few cases we could document historically while neighbors were something else already. But let's say they eventually got civilized in process, and they wanted to enjoy the benefits of civilization. In fact, you don't really find any Germanic people differently, I don't know, from the Huns and others that really came from another world that couldn't even afford to settle down in Europe, destroyed only in places that they were passing by, right? Not the places where they would have had to settle. They would have been idiotic, right, to say the least. And so great part, of course, of this Roman legacy was assimilated in ways that you would be surprised by, even just in spiritual, religious, military history, that we will hopefully stress, in other videos. And you have a face of the world with these wilderness, forests, swamps mostly, that in most of Europe were reality, especially in Central, Northern, Eastern Europe. That's basically what it was, right? And that's why it was, it wasn't pretty much there to kind of develop from. I mean, even in perspective, those are areas that just in the last 100 years really came to be something historical, like even deeply westernized, modernized, and rich countries. Like today you pick Scandinavia, they emerged like as countries like with some, say, gapping the civilizational development with the rest of the continent like a few hundred years ago. That's the measure of the primitiveness of where we stem from historically. Even just if you think, I don't know, but it could be the world 2,000 years ago. Even in the Roman Empire, again, it was extremely primitive. And the difficulty of claiming back from nature those lands for expansion was enormous. And so the demographic fold didn't help at that point. Humans tend to expand when they have enough resources just by themselves. Like even demography is connected to that. Climate change is being brought too much at the center of attention because it's said now every kind of expansion or contraction in civilization, it's climate change. You can't explain anything in complex terms, so it must be a monofactorial explanation that we already know. It doesn't make any sense in the realm of any political, social context. No, humans can fuck things up pretty well all on their own without even affecting the climate too much in the process. People had been killing each other dramatically. I mean, among the Roman civil wars and the barbarian invasions, like people died. People freaking died. But it's not that they died just because somebody, cut their head with a sword. I mean, the whole freaking thing contracted. People lost security. They lost any even hope, right? Those colonists, those serfs, were a lost herd. And how do you make children in this world, right? Many children died, first of all. But even just we know that the insecurity is, how do we even live? How do I feed them? Even if, contraceptive means weren't quite there successfully. But, you have to feed those children. And a normal practice that was up to a few hundred years ago was actually to kill them. Telling the truth. This baby died in sleep. Who knows why? You actually choked him during the night, right? This is pretty standard. We know what the misery and the disgusting reality of the lower world is because we documented it, right? We have enough historical evidence from pre-industrial societies in very early times. I mean, you can even study, Scotland in the 18th century and seeing what the peasantry really was in history, like rape, incest, any form of possible abuse, radical moral and material misery. There's nothing positive or romantic or appreciable from that, right? It's just that people were that morally loaded to cope with this living hell from ever. Because this was reality from ever. there had never been anything different like today. Today we are dramatically spoiled, ungrateful, and possibly even in this sense disgusting those people, because those people at least were the ones that died and worked to make us have what we have today. Those that had to live in that way, and it's not that, even your grandparents lived in ways that, have seen you saying, but what kind of slob are you? Let's be honest. So, insecurity, demographic crisis, people stopped even controlling nature. Dams were destroyed, or we find it in many other contexts as well, because nobody upkept them. The same forests, if you don't have enough manpower, you can't really keep them tidy and orderly as normally forests were when there was enough population to control them. So nature claimed back an enormous amount of space as well. This would happen even in the mid 14th century with the plague. Again, we know that, and those are dramatically better documented times. We know it very well, very precisely. But it's like, I don't know, during lockdown in 2020, I mean, there were wild boars entering cities where normally you would never see them. I mean, that's literally how it happens and how quick it happens, because nature swallows everything, right? So you have to really work hard to keep it under control. So just imagine it with the means of the time and the population of the time. It's really hard. It takes an overwhelming lot of work, of calories. And again, these people were just, for the most, trying to survive. And things got worse in the transition between the Roman Empire and other dominations, because the beginnings were not easy, right? We have seen it, for example, we talked a lot about Longobard, Italy, and especially the moment of the invasion. Those were rough times. Later on, were kind of good, better. There was a stability, because when the political unity consolidated and peace, order, control followed. But at the moment of the invasion, where every duke did whatever the hell he wanted and settled, carving sceneries, etc., it was a hell of a problem, because again, these conquerors wouldn't raid the areas where they would settle. They would, however, raid the areas around, because there were other people from the other side that garrisons the empire, etc., would say, wait a minute. And the communities even said, what do we do now? Right? These people don't even speak our own language. They come from a completely different mindset. They live in a world, I think, it's dominated by snakes that tear apart humans and with limbs scattered everywhere, and they just, they've never seen a city, essentially. They even just live in a different way. They eat differently. Then things gradually, osmotically homogenize, right? And then you can have actually a very positive outcome, as it would happen. But in the first moments, like, wait a minute, this is a problem. Like, how do we cope with that? Somebody had to work that out. In that case, in the Italian example we made many times, that the actual tragedy we know was the ruinous Gothic War, right? The Byzantines deciding to reconquer Italy from the Goths after having sent them to rule them on behalf of Constantinople. And that was a tragedy. It was a complete mishandling, especially from the imperial side. Our situation could have been much smoother. In any case, it was a massive disruption. There was enormous poverty, hunger, that the plague had broke out. And when the Longobards arrived, any possibility to reconstruct in grand style, at least as much as the empire could fund at that point locally, was lost. One could ask at that point, what could 6th century Byzantine Empire would contract with a plague already, and that also would had much later problems, could do systemically to restore kind of the situation. Very few. We know it, for example, from Byzantine Spain or other areas that were retained in Byzantine control, in the far west especially. They declined as well. They also lost the drive, the major infrastructural capacity, because the empire was simply growing smaller itself. It was a moment of overall major decline. So, as you understand, there wasn't really much could be done to avoid this thing in the first place. Or at least because in a positive sense, because again, it's always possible. The problem is who does know how to do it, and who does have the force to achieve that. There were no forces at that time that could achieve that. And paradoxically, in fact, it would be exactly this moment that would sediment, would kind of consolidate the basis that, again, in the West, paradoxically would make this Latin Germanic world expanding more than the same surviving empire in the East. And this should be really appreciated, because it turns out that out of crises there is a way out, right? And that humanity normally works these things out. It can also fail in the process, like those previous crises had not been surpassed, but then humans start working together again, and they manage to remember again what the main the main deal is in terms of what are the things that truly matter to eventually make a civilization grow again. Also, gold that we normally present, everything was untouched from Roman times, there were the latifundia. Well, during the 5th century, they suffered harshly the invasions, especially at the beginning of the century, then with Attila, etc. There were major devastations. Yes, this brought to some kind of reshaping of the political and social situation, and it was the 6th century, especially with the plague, even in there, that killed lots of people. So even there, big changes. The main estates remained, say, it's not much that the estates materially remain intact, it's that the social structure was not much changed, in the sense that the elite always maintain a lot of land in the first place, differently from other places like, again, Italy or Britain, where there was an actual revolution, and the fields had properly been redrawn in ways that, at least on longer term, had probably more beneficial effect for the development of a public order, because the most unruly private aristocracies, like in Gaul and Spain, didn't quite exist in the same way there, but still making paradoxically these countries weaker as a whole, because they didn't have like things like a professional military background, because they didn't have a rich enough elite. We know these things, we told them various times. Now, it's also true that the invasions represented the injection of new inhabitants, but we're talking about a few points percentage compared to the population, to the previous Roman population. Most of the time, so it was not enormous, maybe just in some areas, right? They were significant. These settlements were important, again, because of what they represented politically or militarily than the quantity of the inhabitants, right? And it is also to be considered that the inhabitants, the new ones, so the Germanic peoples at large, were habituated to a type of economy which the uncultivated area had a much greater importance, both for hunting and the grazing, the free grazing, especially of pigs. And they thus contributed to the spontaneous widening of the forestal and moor areas, which is, again, just more like an adaptation to the situation than anything, than a real change. And this last aspect is what we're seeing at the beginning about the also change in the alleged change in diet type. They're saying, in early medieval times people ate more proteins and fats because they were kind of freer, so there were less people around, so in theory there were more resources and therefore they had a better life. What, even if that had been true, it's not that fats and proteins spare you from, the absence of a police force and and being killed by somebody, or that in absolute terms you were satisfactorily nourished, or that eating this stuff turns you into kind of a superhero. No, we know what people look like in pre-industrial societies, even when they eat proteins and fats, and they don't look pretty good. Let me tell you, and this trend is, if anything, in fact, just showed by the general worsening on the condition of the freemen on the longer run, because the elites took over. Like what would become feudalism was advancing in this sense. Also because, and this happened, as we've seen many times, because the same freemen asked for that protection in exchange for personal freedom, because they couldn't provide it by themselves. And this is the mythology of individualism, saying, freer, this world was better than those damn, Roman times or feudal times where everybody was a serf. Oh my God, what a terrible thing. Actually, it wasn't really true, right? Again, the fact that you're on paper freer, paper wasn't around there, at least up to the mid-8th century in the Arab world, speaking from a more like a Western Eurasian perspective, but meaning that this is what it's usually sold. There was such greater freedom that these people enjoyed. Like if you see even, during the Viking era, women were free to, were freer than those damn Catholic countries. They knew. It's actually wrong, right? People lived much better in other countries, and the fact that you're less regulated simply means that that's a world where the mob rules, which is not a very good thing, right? You can, women can divorce, yeah, but they can divorce only because their men decide whether they can or not, right? And if the reasons for which the women can divorce are the same reasons that put men against each other and that kill each other and fight us all the time. And so, no, that doesn't mean that you're freer. Actually, those people lived like shit. And they lived actually in the worst in the entire continent. So the fact that we're freer actually equates exactly to that, to the fact that less developed societies need to be less regulated in the first place, but being less developed is not a good thing, as you can see in the world just right now, right? So this myth of freedom, of individualism, of warriorism, of it's first of all mafia. It's called mafia, right? And that's what basically most of the world was ruled by at the time, and it's not really a good thing. And we struggle to elevate ourselves from that condition, exactly because it didn't work well, because these societies, I said the word, the deep traditions and values, yes, deep tradition and values. Read the sagas and what they actually talk about, and how people interacted among each other, and the level of stability at the time, it was an order, was respected. Yeah, with the famous, deep political and social stability of early medieval times, where, things never changed, everything was peaceful, and nobody get hurt, and, reality is, deep polities with great statal bases, and freedom and purity existed everywhere, to just for this modernity to screw everything up. Again, modernity screwed things up because people in general are bad at handling things, because in any case an improvement is necessary, but it requires much greater and more sophisticated resources, right? So being underdeveloped is nothing to be proud of, right? Like today, right? There is no such thing like, it's better to live in poorer countries, but at least, you don't live in the West where there is, the transgender propaganda. Well, I don't know about you, but nobody ever imposed me any transgender propaganda, and I spit on it, and I still have a pretty damn high quality of life. And this kind of the actual propaganda I'm worried on is the one in countries that live like shit, where people are arrested just because they of political dissent. They don't have anything, they don't know anything, and no, those are not models of tradition. They're just culturally underdeveloped people. Right, and there is a great difference between tradition and primitiveness, right? There are two very different things, because the world has always showed, as we were saying at the beginning, that there is those who know how to rule and the masses that don't count anything. And the masses that don't count anything because they literally don't count anything. Not because somebody makes them so, but because they make themselves so. So in every world, there is the tradition that is championed just by those who actually achieve the results. The others are not traditionals. They, in fact, go against the order of clarity, reason, the Apollonian ideal of the celestial rulers of the sky. They are the Pelagian, Chthonic, superstitious, Dionysian creatures that crawl in the underworld and believe that they're obsessed with, with phobias, and they're paranoid and insecure, and that's why they are under, right? And this happens within every individual's soul for them to understand. And this happens in every community. So we should look at those who achieved and accomplished rather than, what kind of, other horizontal divide is. Because if you don't understand the vertical divide, I'm sorry, but you are a fourth estater as well. And that's the severe problem with civilization, because frankly, we need fourth estaters as long as they obey, and we can treat them as serfs, not really for any other reason, or any other purpose. But the beautiful thing is that, and that's what also the Roman world showed, the Germanic world showed, the Christian world showed, that you can always become better. Hell, even Enlightenment, the good part of it, says that you are basically imprisoned by a condition of inferiority which you relegate yourself in. You decide to be that, right? So you can be the next leader, you can be the next elite, you can be the next transfiguring immortal sitting at God's side for your own accomplishments, and it's only up to you. Any kind of things that you put above yourself to justify your inferiority is called superstition and makes you a chthonic serf, nothing else. And there is no surprise, again, in a great boom of the masses like it's been recently, you have the same ideologies that are popping out again, that have always been popping out at those times in history. What's all this radical emotional subjectivism, radical moral relativism as well? I can't think to be, if something hurts me, it must not exist. You must not tell me, because I'm not strong enough to cope with reality. And so all the gender theory, critical race theory, all this bullshit that flattens everything, by the way, because that's the ultimate purpose, is the dehumanization of the individual, the elimination of any kind of worth, culturally, morally, zero, so that you can make the inferior feel equal, not to feel challenged and, complexly inferior to anybody else. The problem is that anybody else says, go F yourself. Because, frankly, I don't give a shit about someone who cannot even defend himself. And this is the entire reality of history, frankly. You can't really support, even a country that cannot defend itself. And we have, that's von Clausewitz, by the way. The same goes with individuals, right? If you don't help yourself, nobody will help you. It's that easy, right? So start doing something in your life. First of all, the rest, nobody cares at all about. So that's pretty much it. In any case, I know that, I have to fill a bit the time here in this videos, because I could have said this full stuff like in 10 minutes, but in general, the point is always that these single things really do not have any historical value, in my opinion, if they're not framed in this view. So you say, but it's your opinion. It's not really my opinion. You see, if you listen to me, first of all, because you think that I have a historical competence, you cannot avoid having this opinion, because my opinion matters as long as it is informed and it's expressed, and I'm able to base it on evidence. And of course it can be debated, whatever, but the question is exactly because you deem that kind of expertise that you need to know what this means, because history is exactly this, right? What I just said, it wouldn't that historical datum wouldn't make sense by itself if it weren't fit in that reality. And what would be the meaning of history if we couldn't use it and if it weren't based in reality? So I know that for many people, this kind of reasoning is completely alien to anything they've been remotely brought up with, because, again, the fourth estate does exist. It's not an opinion, right? It's just that this thing has been erased from your attention, not to make you feel bad about it. But that's probably the single most irresponsible thing that you can do, right? Not distinguishing, like just having bidimensional view of the world from which you can't distinguish even some other levels of knowledge is effectively equating to having no understanding at all for what you should in order to be a mature individual worth of this name. This is what my historical journey brought me to understand, right? Because I can assess easily that in my path, I have sedimented this understanding that if I hadn't gone through that path, hadn't accumulated properly that knowledge and had sorted it out, I would have not had the palest idea of it existing. I could have maybe guessed it in some ways, but I would have never visualized it, pictured, articulated, expressed it. And instead, I do this. So again, it can be painful to hear, it can be antipathetic, you can think I'm a hay-hole, but actually, the single most important thing that I can give you in terms of historical expertise is exactly this interpretation. Because without that, nothing has a meaning. And again, this is exactly the problem. We have been deprived of this mechanism exactly to deprive ourselves of any possible meaning. And so if you feel bad about what I said, just know that it could be the first step to acknowledge what you really need to become a better human, right? And again, I don't say it because I think I'm a prophet or anything. It's just, again, because in my field, and it's specifically one of history that is extremely delicate and unique in its own kind, this was really evident throughout all I went through. And it doesn't, like, it's not a specific, as you understand, I don't know, it's a conspiracy theory in the form of a delusion, like the reptilians, because I fixated specifically on it's a, again, comprehensive explanation, which objectively does make sense and clears, at least for me, works beautifully, because I get wrong ever less frequently, because I do in my work, and I expect things that are in a certain way, and I start getting them right every time because I can fact check them, and I kind of already had that guess, because most of the time this derives from having actually a simpler view of the world. It takes a lot because we have been deluded by overcomplications. Everything is actually much simpler than it seems. It just takes time to see it. Once you have, it's like coming to the top of a mountain. You can crawl up to it and seeing all these various places you cross, but it's not until you know them, you think even to know them well, then it's not until you go on the top that you can actually visualize how altogether they actually look, and appreciating properly what they are from that top. So that's the sense of elevation. Otherwise, again, you have only a bidimensional view, and it's of no use, because reality, it's not bidimensional. It's another thing entirely. And even though it's difficult to frame it, because we don't really know how much there is, besides what we don't know yet, but still, what we know, we can know, right? And this is a Kantian concept, by the way, so it comes straight from the lucidity, probably of the top of moment of the cross-section of moral and scientific understanding we've ever had in the history of civilization, also the stuff from which von Clausewitz comes from, we have been declining again. It may be a very dark time ahead, but I don't need to remind you, considering the world situation right now. You understand it yourself at least, because we are also wired to understand such things in our community, in the world. In any case, for today, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.